The gunshot that rang through the streets of Ski-Doo, California, in the autumn of 1877 sent everyone scrambling, but it was the sight of the woman stumbling into the market square afterward that made Garrett Nash freeze mid-stride, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip, as he watched her collapse against a wooden post, her dress torn to ribbons and her entire body trembling like a leaf in a windstorm. He had been leading his horse toward the livery stable after 3 weeks on the trail, dust still coating his leather vest and his throat parched enough to drink the town well dry, but something in the way she crumpled there, desperate and alone, while everyone else scattered like startled chickens, made him forget about water and rest. Garrett dropped his horse's reins and crossed the distance between them in long strides, his boots kicking up little clouds of dirt from the dry ground. The woman looked up at him with eyes so wide and frightened, he felt something twist hard in his chest, and without thinking he shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. "Easy now," he said, keeping his voice low and steady the way he would with a spooked horse. "Nobody's going to hurt you." She clutched the coat around herself with white-knuckled fingers, and he could see bruises blooming purple and yellow along her collarbone, where the torn fabric of her dress exposed skin. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in, hanging in tangled waves around a face that would have been beautiful if it were not so marked by terror and exhaustion. Blood had dried in a thin line from a cut above her eyebrow, and her feet were bare and filthy, as if she had been running for miles. "They killed him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They killed my father and burned our homestead, and I ran. I just ran and ran until I could not run anymore." Garrett felt his jaw tighten. He had seen enough violence in his 30 years to know that the West was not kind to those who could not defend themselves, but that did not make it any easier to stomach when he saw the results standing right in front of him. "Who did this?" "The Douglas gang," she managed to say, before a sob escaped her throat. "They wanted our land, wanted the water rights, and Papa would not sell, so they just took everything." The name hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. He knew the Douglas gang, knew them too damn well. They were a pack of ruthless thieves and killers led by Marcus Douglas, a man with cold eyes and colder morals who had been terrorizing the scattered homesteads around Ski-Doo for the better part of a year. The local law had been either too scared or too paid off to do anything about it, and honest folks had been suffering for it. "Come on," Garrett said, gently taking her elbow. "You cannot stay out here in the open like this. Let me get you somewhere safe." She looked at him with those frightened eyes, and he could see her calculating whether she could trust him, whether he was just another predator in a land full of them. He held her gaze and waited, letting her make the choice, and after a long moment she nodded and let him guide her down the street. His horse followed obediently behind, well trained enough not to need the reins held. The boarding house where Garrett had been planning to get a room sat at the end of the main street, a 2-story building with faded white paint and a proprietor named Mrs. Chen, who had a reputation for being both fair and discreet. He helped the woman up the front steps, feeling how heavily she leaned on him, how close she was to complete collapse. As Chen took one look at them through the screen door and opened it wide without a word, gesturing them inside. "She needs a room and a hot bath," Garrett said, "and probably a doctor." Mrs. Chen nodded briskly, already moving toward the stairs. "Bring her up. Second room on the left. I will heat the water." The woman swayed on her feet as they climbed the stairs, and Garrett ended up half carrying her the last few steps. The room Mrs. Chen had indicated was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a washstand in the corner. He eased the woman down onto the bed, and she curled into herself immediately, still wrapped in his coat. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him through the tangled curtain of her hair. Adaline Oliver." "Garrett Nash," he said. "You are safe here, Adaline. I am going to make sure of that." She nodded, but he could see she did not quite believe him yet. He could not blame her for that. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway with an armful of towels and a concerned expression, and Garrett stepped back to let her take over, knowing that Adaline would probably feel more comfortable with another woman right now. He left the room and headed back downstairs, his mind already working through what needed to happen next. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him too much of fire. He retrieved his horse and took care of getting the animal settled in the livery before heading to the saloon, where information flowed more freely than whiskey if you knew who to ask and how to ask them. The saloon was already filling up with the evening crowd, ranch hands and miners and drifters all looking to wash away the day's troubles with alcohol and cards. Garrett ordered a whiskey and leaned against the bar, listening to the conversations around him. It did not take long before he heard someone mention the Douglas gang, bragging about how they had run off another homesteader and taken his land. The speaker was a thin man with a weasel face and a holster slung low on his hip, clearly trying to impress the woman sitting next to him with tales of violence and theft. Garrett felt his hands curl into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm and keep listening. According to the weasel-faced man, the Douglas gang had been holed up somewhere in the hills east of town, using an old mining camp as their base. They had been picking off isolated homesteads one by one, either forcing people to sell for pennies or just killing them and forging the paperwork later. The local sheriff was supposedly in Douglas's pocket, getting a cut of the profits in exchange for looking the other way. It was a sick system, but Garrett had seen similar setups before in other towns across the West. He finished his whiskey and left the saloon, heading back to the boarding house as darkness settled over Ski-Doo. Mrs. Chen met him at the door with a grave expression. She is sleeping now, but she was very distressed. The doctor came and looked at her injuries. Nothing broken, but she has been through a terrible ordeal. "Can I see her?" Garrett asked. Mrs. Chen hesitated, then nodded. Briefly, "She needs rest more than anything." He climbed the stairs quietly and eased open the door to Adaline's room. She was lying in the bed, her hair spread across the pillow, and her face finally peaceful in sleep. Someone had cleaned the cut on her forehead and dressed it with a bandage, and she was wearing a clean nightgown that Mrs. Chen must have provided. His coat was folded neatly on the chair beside the bed. Garrett stood there for a long moment, just watching her breathe, and felt something shift inside him that he could not quite name. He had been alone for a long time. After his wife had died of fever 5 years ago, he had thrown himself into work, taking jobs as a ranch hand and trail guide, and sometimes hired gun when the cause was just. He had told himself he was fine with the solitary life, that he did not need anyone else, but standing here looking at Adaline Oliver, he felt the lie of that crack wide open. There was something about her that called to him, something beyond just the desire to protect someone in trouble. Garrett left the room and went to get his own accommodations sorted out, taking the room directly across the hall from Adaline's. He did not sleep well that night, startling awake at every creak and groan of the old building, his hand reaching instinctively for his gun each time. When dawn finally broke, he was already dressed and downstairs, drinking coffee in Mrs. Chen's kitchen while she prepared breakfast. "You have kind eyes, Mrs. Chen said, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon across the table to him. "That girl is lucky you found her." "I just did what anyone would do," Garrett said. Mrs. Chen snorted. "You and I both know that is not true. Most men in this town would have walked right past her, or worse, taken advantage of her vulnerable state. You are different." He did not know what to say to that, so he focused on his breakfast. Adaline came downstairs about an hour later, moving slowly and carefully like everything hurt. She was wearing a simple dress that Mrs. Chen must have lent her, and her hair was braided back from her face. The bruises looked darker in the morning light, but her eyes were clearer, more focused. "Good morning," Garrett said, standing up. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was trampled by a stampede," Adaline said, but there was a hint of wry humor in her voice that had not been there the night before. "But better than yesterday. Thank you for helping me. I do not even want to think about what might have happened if you had not been there." "Sit down and eat something," Mrs. Chen instructed, already preparing another plate. "You need to rebuild your strength." Adaline obeyed, sinking into the chair across from Garrett with a small sigh of relief. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, as if she had not realized how starved she was until food was in front of her. Garrett watched her, trying not to be too obvious about it, and found himself noticing little things. The way she held her fork, the slight crook in her nose that suggested it had been broken once long ago, the freckles scattered across her cheekbones. "What will you do now?" he asked when she had finished eating. Adaline set down her fork and looked at him with those serious dark eyes. "I do not know. I have nothing left. No home, no family, no money. Everything I owned burned with our house. The Douglas gang needs to answer for what they did," Garrett said carefully. Her expression hardened. "The Douglas gang has the sheriff in their pocket. There is no law that will touch them, not here. I would need to travel to the territorial capital to report it properly, and even then, who knows if anyone would care about one dead homesteader and his daughter. She was right, and they both knew it. Justice in the West was a fragile, unreliable thing, especially for those without power or money. Garrett found himself making a decision that he knew was probably reckless, but felt right anyway. What if we made them answer for it ourselves? Adaline stared at him. What do you mean? I mean, I go after them. I make them pay for what they did to you and your father and all the other people they have hurt. I am good with a gun, and I know how to track men who do not want to be found. That is insane, Adaline said flatly. You would be killed. There are at least a dozen men in that gang, maybe more. I have faced worse odds before. Why would you even do this? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything. Garrett leaned forward, holding her gaze. Because it is the right thing to do. Because someone needs to stand up to men like Marcus Douglas, or they will just keep taking and killing until there is nothing left but ashes and graves. And because you deserve justice for what was done to you and your father. He could see her struggling with it, wanting to believe him but afraid to hope. Mrs. Chen had quietly excused herself from the kitchen, leaving them alone with this conversation. Finally, Adaline spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If you are serious about this, then I want to help. I want to be part of bringing them down. Absolutely not, Garrett said immediately. It is too dangerous. It was my father they killed, Adaline shot back, and there was steel in her voice now, under the exhaustion and fear. It was my home they burned. I will not just sit here safe while someone else fights my battles for me. Besides, I know things about the Douglas gang that might help. I know their patterns when they scout properties, how many men they typically send on raids. I paid attention to things my father discussed with the other homesteaders. Garrett wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she needed to stay where it was safe, but he recognized the look on her face. It was the same stubborn determination he had seen in his wife's eyes years ago when she had insisted on traveling with him through hostile territory instead of staying behind. Adaline had already lost everything. Maybe denying her the chance to fight back would take even more from her. All right, he said finally. But we do this smart, not reckless. We gather information first, figure out exactly where they are and what their movements are like. And you follow my lead when it comes to the dangerous parts. Adaline nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Agreed. They spent the rest of the day planning. Garrett went back to the saloon and struck up conversations, carefully steering them toward the talk of the Douglas gang. Adaline, meanwhile, visited some of the shops in town, talking to the proprietors who knew her family and learning what they knew about the gang's activities. By evening, they had a clearer picture of what they were up against. The Douglas gang was indeed using an old mining camp in the hills as their base, a place called Silver Fork that had been abandoned years ago when the ore played out. They had about 15 men in total, not all of whom were present at the camp at any given time. Marcus Douglas himself was apparently a former Confederate soldier who had turned to crime after the war ended, and he ran his gang with military-style discipline. They had contacts in several towns across the region, fencing stolen goods and selling seized property through crooked land agents. We cannot take on 15 armed men in a direct fight, Garrett said that night as they sat in Mrs. Chen's parlor, maps and notes spread across the table between them. We need to be smarter than that. What if we split them up? Adaline suggested. If we could lure some of them away from the camp, deal with them in smaller groups. That could work, Garrett mused, studying the map. But we would need to be very careful about how we do it. These are not stupid men. They have survived this long because they are cautious and well organized. They talked late into the night, developing and discarding plans until finally they had something that might actually work. It would require careful timing and a fair amount of luck, but it was possible. Garrett found himself impressed by Adaline's tactical thinking. She had a sharp mind and a good grasp of strategy that went beyond what he would have expected from a homesteader's daughter. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked at one point. Adaline smiled slightly. "My father was a captain in the Union Army during the war. He taught me chess when I was young, and we used to discuss military history and tactics. He said a sharp mind was worth more than any weapon." Her smile faded. He was right. He just could not have predicted that his enemy would not fight fair. Garrett reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "We are going to make this right, Adaline. I promise you that." She turned her hand over under his, lacing their fingers together. "I believe you." Something passed between them in that moment, something warm and electric that had nothing to do with vengeance or justice, and everything to do with the way she was looking at him, the way his heart had started beating faster. He thought about kissing her, but held back, knowing it was too soon, knowing she was still raw and hurting from everything she had been through. Over the next 3 days, they prepared. Garrett bought supplies and ammunition, checked over his guns, and made sure his horse was well rested and ready for hard riding. Adaline borrowed a riding outfit from Mrs. Chen and practiced shooting with an old revolver that Garrett had picked up from the general store. She was not a natural shot, but she learned quickly, and by the 3rd day she could hit a target reliably at close range. "You are sure about this?" Garrett asked the night before they were planning to set their plan in motion. They were standing outside the boarding house, looking up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. "I am sure," Adaline said, "scared, but sure. Those men took everything from me, Garrett. If I do not do this, if I do not at least try to make them answer for it, then they win. They get to go on terrorizing people, and I get to spend the rest of my life running and hiding and being afraid." He understood that. He had felt the same way after his wife died. Like, if he did not do something, anything, to fight back against the unfairness of the world, then he would drown in grief and helplessness. "All right then, we ride out at dawn." That night, Garrett lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that could go wrong. There were so many variables, so many ways this could end badly. But he also thought about Adaline, about the strength he had seen growing in her over the past few days, the way her fear was transforming into determination. He thought about how she laughed when she finally hit the center of a target, how she unconsciously touched his arm when she was making a point in conversation, how she looked in the morning light with her hair loose around her shoulders. He was falling for her. That was a complication he had not anticipated, but it was undeniable now. Somewhere between wrapping his coat around her in the market square and planning this revenge mission with her, he had started caring about Adaline Oliver in a way that went far beyond simple protection or justice. He wanted to keep her safe, yes, but he also wanted to know everything about her, wanted to hear her laugh more, wanted to see what her life could become when she was not weighed down by trauma and loss. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky turning from black to deep blue to pale gold as the sun climbed over the eastern mountains. Garrett saddled both horses while Adaline packed their supplies into saddlebags. Mrs. Chen came out to see them off, pressing a package of food into Adaline's hands and hugging her tightly. "You be careful," the older woman said, "and you come back here when this is done. You understand? You will always have a place here." Adaline's eyes were bright with tears as she nodded and returned the hug. Then she swung up into her saddle with the ease of someone who had been riding since childhood, and Garrett felt a surge of admiration for her courage. They rode out of Skidoo as the town was just waking up, heading east toward the hills where the Douglas gang had their camp. The terrain grew rougher as they left the town behind, the flat desert giving way to rocky slopes and scattered juniper trees. They followed deer trails and dry creek beds, staying off the main roads where they might be spotted. Garrett had scouted the area over the past few days, getting a sense of the land and the best approaches to Silver Fork. The old mining camp sat in a narrow canyon with only 2 ways in or out, which made it defensible, but also meant the gang could be trapped if someone blocked those exits. Their plan was to first observe the camp from a distance, get a count of how many men were present and what their routines looked like. Then they would set a fire in the hills above the camp, creating smoke and confusion while Garrett picked off the gang members who came out to investigate. It was not a perfect plan, but it was the best they could come up with given their limited resources. They reached a ridge overlooking Silver Fork around midday and dismounted, leaving the horses tied in a sheltered spot where they would not be visible from below. Garrett pulled out the spyglass he had bought and trained it on the camp. He counted 8 men moving around among the ramshackle buildings, which meant at least half the gang was elsewhere, probably out scouting new targets or conducting other business. 8 is better than 15, Adaline murmured beside him. 8 is still a lot for 2 people, Garrett pointed out, but he was already running through the plan in his mind, adjusting it for the smaller numbers. "We will wait until evening, when they are settling in for the night. That is when we set the fire." They spent the afternoon watching and waiting, learning the patterns of movement below. Adaline lay beside him on the ridge, occasionally taking the spyglass to observe for herself. At one point, she gasped softly. "What is it?" Garrett asked. "That man there, with the red bandana. He was one of the ones who came to our homestead. I recognize him." Her voice was tight with suppressed emotion. Garrett found the man in question through the spyglass. He was tall and broad-shouldered, laughing at something another gang member had said. "Are you going to be all right with this? If you want to stay back when the action starts, I will understand." "No," Adaline said firmly. "I need to do this. I need to see it through." As the sun began to set, they moved into position. Garrett had identified a stand of dry brush on the hillside above the camp that would burn hot and fast, creating plenty of smoke. They crept through the gathering darkness, moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose rocks that might alert the men below. Adaline carried a bundle of dry grass and kindling, while Garrett had his rifle slung across his back and matches in his pocket. They reached the brush, and Garrett built a small fire, feeding it until the flames were strong enough to catch on the larger branches. The dry vegetation caught quickly, and within minutes, a column of smoke was rising into the darkening sky. Shouts of alarm came from the camp below as the gang members spotted the fire. Garrett and Adaline retreated to a rocky outcrop that gave them cover and a clear view of the camp. He positioned himself with his rifle, sighting along the barrel, while Adaline crouched beside him with her revolver drawn. His heart was pounding, adrenaline sharpening his senses. Men were boiling out of the buildings now, pointing at the fire and arguing about what to do. Garrett waited until 4 of them started up the hillside toward the flames. Then he took aim and fired. The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the canyon, and the lead man dropped. The others scattered, diving for cover, and chaos erupted below as the remaining gang members tried to figure out where the shot had come from. Garrett worked the bolt on his rifle and fired again, clipping another man who had been trying to circle around toward their position. Adaline fired her revolver at someone who emerged from behind a building, the shot going wide but forcing the man to duck back. It was working. The gang was confused and disorganized, but they were also heavily armed and starting to return fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them, kicking up sparks and stone chips. Garrett kept firing, making each shot count, keeping the gang members pinned down and unable to mount an organized defense. The fire on the hillside was spreading now, the smoke thick and acrid, making it hard to see. That worked in their favor, giving them cover as they repositioned. A man suddenly appeared on the rocks above them, having circled around while they were focused on the camp below. He raised his pistol, but Adaline was faster, firing twice and hitting him in the chest. He tumbled backward with a cry and disappeared over the edge. She stared at where he had been, her face pale in the firelight, and Garrett knew she had just killed someone for the first time. "You did good," he said quickly. "He would have killed us both. Stay focused." She nodded jerkily and turned back to watch the camp. The fight was turning in their favor. Several gang members were down, and the others were being forced to choose between fighting and fleeing the spreading fire. 2 of them made a break for the horses tied at the far end of the camp, and Garrett let them go. He was not interested in wholesale slaughter, just in making sure the Douglas gang could not hurt anyone else. A bullet struck the rock inches from Garrett's head, and he dropped flat, pulling Adaline down with him. Someone below had gotten a bead on their position. He risked a quick look and spotted the shooter, a man with long, dark hair crouched behind a water trough. Garrett lined up his shot carefully, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The man jerked and fell sideways. The remaining gang members seemed to lose their nerve after that. Garrett saw 3 of them running for the canyon exit, abandoning their companions and their camp. He did not try to stop them. The important thing was that the Douglas gang was broken, scattered, no longer the organized threat they had been. "Is it over?" Adaline asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Not yet," Garrett said. "We need to make sure Marcus Douglas is not still down there." They made their way carefully down the hillside as full darkness fell, approaching the camp from an angle that kept them in shadow. The fire was still burning above, casting wild, dancing light across the scene. Bodies lay scattered among the buildings, and the place had the eerie quiet of a battlefield after the fighting ends. Garrett checked each building methodically, rifle at the ready, while Adaline covered him from outside. They found supplies, stolen goods, paperwork that documented the gang's crimes in cold detail. But they did not find Marcus Douglas. Either he had not been at the camp today, or he had been one of the ones who escaped. "We should take those documents," Adaline said, pointing at the stack of papers. "They are evidence. If we can get them to the territorial authorities, maybe they will finally do something about what is left of this gang. Garrett agreed, and they spent a few minutes gathering up the most incriminating papers and stuffing them into a saddlebag. As they were working, he heard a sound behind them and spun, raising his rifle, but it was just one of the horses that had been tied up, now loose and nervous from all the gunfire and smoke. They left Silver Fork as the fire burned itself out on the hillside above, the old mining camp a scene of destruction and defeat. Garrett felt grim satisfaction, but no joy. He had killed men tonight, and while he believed it had been necessary, it still weighed on him. Beside him, Adaline was silent, her face drawn. They rode through the darkness, putting distance between themselves and the camp, until they found a sheltered spot among some rocks where they could rest. Garrett built a small fire, while Adaline tended to the horses, and then they sat together, not speaking at first, just processing everything that had happened. "Are you all right?" Garrett asked eventually. Adaline was quiet for a long moment. "I thought I would feel better. I thought when we made them pay for what they did, when we hurt them the way they hurt us, I would feel some kind of satisfaction or closure. But I just feel empty and sad." "Revenge is like that," Garrett said quietly. "It never feels as good as you think it will. But what we did tonight was not just revenge, Adaline. We stopped them from hurting more people. We broke up a gang of killers and thieves. That matters." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. They sat like that for a while, drawing comfort from each other's presence. The night was cold, and stars blazed overhead in the clear desert sky, so many of them that it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. "What happens now?" Adaline asked. "Now we take those documents to the territorial capital like you suggested," Garrett said. "We make sure the authorities know what the Douglas gang was doing and that the local sheriff was complicit. And then," he hesitated. "And then what? And then you decide what you want to do with your life. You are free now, Adaline. Free from the gang, free from fear. You can go anywhere, be anything." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the firelight. "What if I want to stay with you?" Garrett's breath caught. "You do not know what you are saying. You have been through a trauma, and I was there to help you. That does not mean you owe me anything, or that you have to stay with me." "I know that," Adaline said, and there was that steel in her voice again. "I am not some fragile thing who does not know her own mind, Garrett Nash. I am saying that over these past days, I have come to care about you. I have seen your kindness and your courage and your sense of justice, and I want to be with you, not because you saved me, but because of who you are." He looked at her, at this woman who had lost everything, and yet still had the strength to hope, to fight, to love, and he felt something in his chest crack open. "I care about you too. I think I started caring about you the moment I saw you in that market square. But I need you to be sure, Adaline. I need you to be choosing this, choosing me, because it is what you really want." "I am sure," she said, and then she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss or a tentative one. It was fierce and certain, her hands coming up to frame his face as she pressed her mouth to his. Garrett responded in kind, pulling her closer, pouring into the kiss all the feelings he had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "All right then," he said, his voice rough. "We do this together, all of it." They did not get much sleep that night, talking and kissing and making plans for a future that felt suddenly real and possible. By the time the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Garrett felt like a different man than he had been just a week ago. He had purpose again, and more than that, he had someone to share his life with. The journey to the territorial capital took 5 days of hard riding. They traveled through varied terrain, from desert flats to pine-forested mountains, camping under the stars each night. Garrett taught Adaline more about tracking and wilderness survival, and she told him stories about her childhood, about her father's gentleness and her mother, who had died when Adaline was young. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other in the way new lovers do, discovering shared humor and values and dreams. At night, they would lie together by the fire, Adaline tucked against Garrett's side, and he would marvel at how natural it felt, how right. He had thought after his wife died that he would never feel this way again. That part of his heart was closed forever, but Adaline had opened it back up, not by replacing what he had lost, but by creating something entirely new. The territorial capital was a bustling town called Prescott, much larger and more civilized than Skidoo. They found the marshal's office and presented their evidence, the documents from the Douglas gang camp, along with Adaline's testimony about the attack on her family's homestead. The territorial marshal was a grizzled man named Coleman who listened carefully to their story and examined the papers with growing anger. "This is exactly what we have been trying to build a case about," Marshal Coleman said. "We have had reports of gang activity in that region for months, but the local law enforcement kept claiming there was no problem. This proves what we suspected about Sheriff Norton being corrupt." "What will happen now?" Garrett asked. "I will send deputies to Skidoo to arrest Norton and round up what is left of the Douglas gang. With this evidence, we can prosecute them properly." Coleman looked at Adaline with sympathy. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Oliver. Your father sounds like he was a good man who did not deserve what happened to him." "Thank you," Adaline said quietly. "I just want to make sure this does not happen to anyone else." "You have done that," Coleman assured her. "What you two did, breaking up that gang, it took real courage. If you ever want work as a deputy marshal, Nash, you come talk to me." Garrett thanked him, but said he had other plans. They left the marshal's office and walked through the streets of Prescott, taking in the sights of the larger town. There were proper shops here, and a theater, and even a small library. It was the kind of place where a person could build a real life. "We could stay here," Garrett suggested as they sat in a restaurant having their first real meal in days. "Start over. I could find work, maybe buy some land. You could pursue whatever interest you want. There are opportunities in a town like this that do not exist in smaller places." Adaline considered this, poking at her food with her fork. "That sounds nice, but I think I would like to go back to Skidoo eventually. Not to stay necessarily, but to see it through. To make sure the new law enforcement is actually cleaning things up, to testify if there are trials, and maybe to see Mrs. Chen again. She was so kind to me." "We can do that," Garrett agreed. "We can go back for a while, settle affairs, and then decide where we want to make our permanent home." They spent a week in Prescott while the territorial marshal organized his operation against the Douglas gang. During that time, Garrett and Adaline stayed in a small hotel and explored the town, talking seriously about their future. Garrett had some money saved from his years of work, enough to buy a small piece of land if they were careful. Adaline had skills in managing a household and bookkeeping that could translate into work in town. One evening, as they walked along a path by a creek that ran through Prescott, Garrett stopped and turned to face Adaline. "I know we have not known each other long, just over 2 weeks, but I also feel like I have known you much longer than that, like I was waiting my whole life to find you. Adaline Oliver, would you marry me?" Adaline's eyes went wide, and then they filled with tears, but she was smiling. Yes, absolutely yes." He kissed her there by the creek as the sun set and the first stars appeared, and he felt complete in a way he had not felt in years. They were married 3 days later by a justice of the peace, with Marshal Coleman and his wife standing as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, nothing fancy, but it felt perfect. Adaline wore a blue dress she had bought in one of Prescott's shops, and Garrett wore his cleanest clothes with his hair combed back and his boots polished. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the justice of the peace said, and Garrett pulled Adaline into his arms and kissed her as his wife for the first time. They spent their wedding night in the hotel, and it was everything a wedding night should be, tender and passionate and full of promises for the future. Adaline fell asleep in Garrett's arms, and he lay awake for a while, just watching her, feeling grateful beyond words that fate had brought them together. The next morning, they received word from Marshal Coleman that his deputies had successfully arrested Sheriff Norton and 3 remaining members of the Douglas gang in Skidoo. Marcus Douglas himself was still at large, but with his organization broken up and his operations exposed, he was now a fugitive with nowhere to hide. Coleman expected he would be caught within a few weeks. "We should go back to Skidoo," Adaline said. "I want to testify, and I want to make sure this is really finished." They made the journey back, taking their time now, stopping to camp in beautiful spots and enjoying being together without the weight of danger and revenge pressing on them. When they finally rode into Skidoo, the town looked different somehow, cleaner and more hopeful. Mrs. Chen came running out of the boarding house when she saw them, crying with joy and hugging them both. "I heard what you did," she said. "The whole town has been talking about it. "You are heroes." "We are not heroes," Garrett said, uncomfortable with the praise. "We just did what needed doing." But the townspeople clearly disagreed. Over the next few days, as the trials were organized and testimony was heard, Garrett and Adaline found themselves treated with respect and gratitude by people who had been living in fear. The new acting sheriff, a fair-minded man named Thompson, who had been appointed by the territorial marshal, made sure the legal proceedings were handled properly. Adaline testified about the attack on her homestead and her father's murder, her voice strong and clear, despite the difficulty of recounting those memories. Several other victims of the Douglas gang also came forward with their stories, and the picture that emerged was of a systematic campaign of terror and theft. Sheriff Norton and the captured gang members were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. 2 weeks after the trials ended, word came that Marcus Douglas had been caught trying to cross into Mexico. He was brought back to Prescott to face justice, and though Garrett and Adaline could have traveled there to see him tried and convicted, they chose not to. That chapter of their lives was closed. It was time to look forward. They had been staying at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, but they started looking for a place of their own. Garrett did not want to be a rancher or a homesteader. The life was too isolated and too risky, as Adaline's father had learned. Instead, he was drawn to the idea of providing security and justice in a more official capacity. He accepted a job as a deputy in Skidoo, working under Sheriff Thompson to help keep the peace. Adaline, meanwhile, discovered an opportunity that excited her. The town schoolteacher had recently moved away to be with family back east, and Skidoo needed someone to educate its children. Adaline had been well educated by her father, and she loved the idea of teaching. She applied for the position and was hired, despite some initial resistance from town council members who thought a woman so young and newly married should be focused on starting a family rather than teaching. "I can do both," Adaline told them firmly. "Women are not so fragile that they can only handle one responsibility at a time." She won them over with her intelligence and determination, and by late autumn of 1877, she was standing in front of a classroom of 20 children, teaching them reading and arithmetic and history. Garrett would sometimes stop by the schoolhouse on his rounds, and he loved watching her work, seeing the way she engaged with her students and made learning exciting for them. They bought a small house on the edge of town, a 2-room structure that needed work but had good bones and a pretty view of the mountains. Garrett spent his free time fixing it up, repairing the roof and building new furniture, while Adaline painted walls and planted a garden. It became a home, their home, filled with laughter and love and the ordinary routines of married life. Winter came, and with it the first real test of their relationship. Living together day in and day out, dealing with the challenges of work and household management and the simple fact of learning to accommodate another person's habits and quirks, they had their share of disagreements, but they had both been through enough to know that what they had was worth fighting for, worth compromising and communicating and working through the rough patches. Christmas of 1877 found them snowed in for 3 days, the rare winter storm that hit the high desert dumping several inches of snow on Skidoo. They spent those days curled up together by the fire, reading and talking and making love, and Garrett thought it might be the happiest he had ever been. Adaline gave him a new hat she had saved up to buy, and he gave her a locket with a tiny photograph of them that a traveling photographer had taken. She cried when she opened it, touching the locket like it was the most precious thing in the world. "I love you so much," she said. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is real, that I have you, that we have this life together." "It is real," Garrett assured her, pulling her close, "and it is only going to get better." Spring came, and with it news that Adaline was pregnant. She told Garrett one evening after he came home from his shift, her eyes bright with excitement and nervousness. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, before carefully setting her down and placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "You and me, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Adaline asked, searching his face. "I am happier than I have any right to be," Garrett told her honestly. "You have given me everything, Adaline, a purpose, a home, and now a family. I love you more than I can express." They prepared for the baby's arrival over the following months, Garrett building a cradle from wood he carefully selected and sanded smooth, Adaline sewing tiny clothes and blankets. Mrs. Chen was beside herself with excitement, offering advice and insisting on organizing a party to celebrate the coming child. The whole town seemed to share in their happiness, the school children making drawings for the baby, and the other deputies teasing Garrett good-naturedly about impending fatherhood. The baby came in November of 1878, a boy they named Gabriel, after Garrett's father, who had died years before. The birth was long and difficult, and there were hours when Garrett paced outside the bedroom, terrified that he was going to lose Adaline the way he had lost his first wife. But Adaline was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and when he finally heard the baby's cry and was allowed into the room, he found her exhausted but smiling, cradling their son against her chest. "He has your eyes," Adaline said softly, touching the baby's tiny face with wonder. Garrett sat beside her on the bed, looking down at his son, at this perfect little person they had created together, and felt tears running down his face. Gabriel had a shock of dark hair and was screaming lustily, clearly unhappy about being thrust into the cold, bright world. But to Garrett, he was the most beautiful thing imaginable. "Hello, Gabriel," he whispered. "Welcome to the world, son. Your mother and I are going to love you and protect you and do our best to raise you right." Being parents transformed their lives in ways both expected and unexpected. The sleepless nights, the constant demands of an infant, the worry about every little sniffle or cry. It was exhausting and overwhelming. But it was also filled with moments of profound joy. Gabriel's first smile, the way he would calm when Garrett held him, the sound of Adaline singing lullabies in the middle of the night. These became the new rhythms of their existence. Adaline took a few months away from teaching to care for Gabriel, but by spring she was back in the schoolhouse, bringing the baby with her. The students loved having Gabriel there, and the older girls would fight over who got to help rock him or walk him around when he fussed. It was unconventional, but this was the West, where people did what they needed to do to survive and thrive. Garrett continued his work as a deputy, building a reputation as someone who was fair but firm, who could be counted on to uphold the law without being brutal about it. Sheriff Thompson relied on him more and more, and there were quiet discussions about Garrett maybe running for sheriff himself when Thompson eventually retired. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple happiness. Gabriel grew into a lively, curious toddler who wanted to explore everything and asked endless questions. When he was 2, Adaline became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1881, a tiny, serious-faced baby they named Anna after Adaline's mother. With 2 children, life became even more chaotic, but they managed. They expanded their house, Garrett building on 2 more rooms with help from friends in town. Adaline reduced her teaching schedule, working part-time so she could be home more with the children. Money was sometimes tight, but they always had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. Gabriel started attending his mother's school when he turned 5, and he proved to be as sharp as she was, reading ahead of his grade level and showing a particular interest in mathematics. Anna was quieter than her brother, more thoughtful, but she had a stubborn streak a mile wide that reminded Garrett of her mother. In 1883, word reached Skidoo that Marcus Douglas had died in prison, killed in a fight with another inmate. Garrett felt nothing at the news except perhaps a sense of finality. That whole chapter, the violence and revenge and darkness, it felt like something from another life. He was a different man now, softer in some ways, but also more complete, more himself. One evening that summer, Garrett and Adaline sat on the porch of their house, watching Gabriel and Anna play in the yard as the sun set. Gabriel was teaching his little sister how to skip rocks in the creek that ran behind their property, his 6-year-old patience being tested by her 3-year-old enthusiasm. "Do you ever think about that day in the market?" Adaline asked quietly. "When we first met?" "All the time," Garrett admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if I had not been there, or if I had just walked past you like everyone else did. I think about all the little choices and accidents that brought us to this moment." Adaline took his hand, lacing their fingers together the way she had that first night when they planned to go after the Douglas gang. "I used to think my life ended the day they attacked our homestead. I thought I had lost everything, and there was nothing left but survival. But I was wrong. That day was not an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of us." "The best beginning," Garrett agreed, pulling her close and kissing her temple. They sat together as darkness fell and the stars came out, listening to their children's laughter, comfortable in the life they had built together from the ashes of tragedy. Skidoo had grown over the years, becoming more prosperous and civilized, but it still had that frontier spirit, that sense of people making their own way in a hard land. When Gabriel was 7 and Anna was 4, Adaline became pregnant for a third time, a surprise that left them both shocked and then delighted. This baby, another boy they named Grant, arrived healthy and squalling in the spring of 1885. Gabriel and Anna were fascinated by their new brother, helping care for him, with the seriousness of children given an important responsibility. Garrett was 38 now, no longer the young cowboy who had wrapped his coat around a frightened woman in the market square. He had gray threading through his hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But he was happy in a deep, settled way that had nothing to do with excitement or adventure, and everything to do with coming home each night to a wife he loved and children who ran to greet him. Adaline had matured too, the trauma of her early losses tempered by years of joy and security. She still taught part-time, still loved engaging young minds, but her primary focus was their family. She had grown into a pillar of the community, respected for her intelligence and her kindness, frequently consulted on matters ranging from education to town planning. In 1887, Sheriff Thompson decided to retire, and the town held an election for his replacement. Garrett was reluctant to run, worried about the additional responsibility and danger, but Adaline encouraged him. "You are already doing the work," she pointed out. "Thompson has relied on you to handle most of the serious situations for years now. The only difference would be the title and a bit more pay. And you are good at it, Garrett. You have kept this town safe while treating people fairly. That is exactly what a sheriff should do." He ran and won easily, becoming Sheriff Nash of Skidoo. It felt strange at first, wearing the badge, being the final authority on law enforcement in the region. But he grew into it, assembling a good team of deputies and maintaining the peace in a way that earned him respect from even the rougher elements of society. The children grew. Gabriel developed an interest in the law like his father, following Garrett around on weekends and asking endless questions about justice and how to determine right from wrong. Anna proved to have her mother's gift for teaching, often helping the younger students at school with their lessons. Grant was still young, a rambunctious 5-year-old who kept them all on their toes. In 1890, as the decade turned, Garrett and Adaline celebrated their 13th wedding anniversary. Garrett arranged for Mrs. Chen to watch the children for a night, and he took Adaline on a ride out to the spot where they had camped after attacking the Douglas gang camp, where they had kissed for the first time and admitted their feelings for each other. 13 years, Adaline marveled, looking around at the familiar landscape. "It feels like yesterday, and also like forever ago." "I would do it all again," Garrett said, pulling her into his arms. "Every moment, every challenge, every fear. It all led to this, to us, to our family. I would not change any of it." "Neither would I," Adaline said, reaching up to touch his face. "You saved my life that day, Garrett, but more than that, you gave me a reason to live it. You gave me love and purpose and a future I never thought I would have." They made love under the stars that night, just the two of them with no children or responsibilities, remembering who they had been and celebrating who they had become. When they rode back to Skidoo the next morning, Garrett felt renewed, reconnected to the core of what mattered most in his life. The 1890s brought changes to Skidoo and the whole territory. Arizona was moving towards statehood, and with it came increased settlement and development. The railroad reached their region, bringing more people and commerce. Skidoo grew from a small frontier town into a proper small city, with electric lights on the main street and regular telegraph service. Gabriel turned 16 in 1892 and announced his intention to study law, to become an attorney who could help people navigate the legal system fairly. Garrett and Adaline were immensely proud, though they worried about the cost of sending him away to school. They managed, though, through careful saving and help from the community that had come to value their family's contributions. Anna, at 13, was already helping her mother teach regularly, proving to be a natural educator with patience and creativity. She talked about maybe attending a normal school to become a certified teacher. Grant, at 10, had not yet settled on any particular interest, bouncing between wanting to be a rancher, a sheriff like his father, or an explorer mapping uncharted territories. In 1895, Adaline's hair had streaks of silver running through it, and Garrett's face was weathered from years in the sun. But they were still deeply in love, still finding joy in each other's company. They had built something lasting, not just in their marriage, but in their community. The schoolhouse that Adaline had taught in for so many years was being replaced with a larger building, and the town council wanted to name it after her in recognition of her service. "That is ridiculous," Adaline protested when they told her. "I just did my job." "You did far more than that," the council chairman said. "You shaped the minds of a generation of children in this town. You deserve recognition." She eventually accepted, though she remained embarrassed by the attention. The new Oliver Schoolhouse opened in the fall of 1896, a fine two-story building with proper classrooms and a library. Gabriel came home from university for the dedication ceremony, proud of his mother and the legacy she was creating. The turn of the century found the Nash family thriving. Gabriel had graduated from law school and was practicing in Phoenix, making a name for himself as an advocate for the rights of small landholders against big corporate interests. Anna had become a teacher in her own right, working in a school in Tucson and writing letters home full of stories about her students. Grant, at 15, had decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, caring for the animals that were so essential to life in the West. Garrett and Adaline were in their early 50s now, settled into the comfortable rhythms of middle age. Garrett still served as sheriff, though he had good deputies who handled most of the daily work. Adaline had retired from teaching, but served on the school board and spent time working in the library that had been established in Skidoo. They had weathered storms together, both literal and metaphorical. There had been years of drought when the gardens withered and money was tight. There had been illness, the terrifying week when Grant had suffered from a high fever that they feared might be something serious before it finally broke. There had been the normal conflicts and frustrations of any long marriage, times when they disagreed or annoyed each other, or just needed space. But through it all, the foundation had held. The love that had sparked in a market square 23 years ago had only grown deeper and more complex, seasoned by time and experience. They knew each other completely now, the good and the bad, the strengths and the weaknesses, and they had chosen each other again and again. One evening in the spring of 1901, they sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children were grown and gone, building their own lives, though they visited regularly and wrote often. The house felt empty sometimes without the chaos of young children, but it also felt peaceful. "Do you have any regrets?" Garrett asked, the question coming out of nowhere. Adaline considered it seriously, as she always did when he asked her something important. "I regret that my father did not get to see the life I built, that he did not get to meet you or know his grandchildren. I regret the violence and loss that brought us together, even though I am grateful for what came from it. But regrets about choosing you, about our life together, not even for a moment." "Good," Garrett said, pulling her close, "because I plan on keeping you around for a long time yet. We have grandchildren to spoil and more memories to make." Adaline laughed, the sound still as beautiful to him as it had been when he first heard it. "I am counting on it." They did become grandparents multiple times over the next few years. Gabriel married a sharp, funny woman named Clara, and they had 3 children in quick succession. Anna married a fellow teacher, and they had twins. Grant brought home a rancher's daughter, and they started a family while he built up his veterinary practice. Garrett and Adaline traveled to visit their children and grandchildren, marveling at the next generation, seeing pieces of themselves reflected in young faces. They told the grandchildren stories about the old days, about how Skidoo had been when they first came there, about the wild and dangerous times they had lived through. But they always came back to Skidoo, to the home they had built together, to the town that had become theirs in every meaningful way. Garrett finally retired as sheriff in 1905, handing over the badge to one of his deputies who had been with him for years. He spent his retirement working in the garden, reading, and taking long rides through the countryside he loved. Adaline continued her community work, always involved in making Skidoo a better place. They grew old together gracefully, their hair going white, their movements slower but still sure. They held hands when they walked through town, and people smiled to see them, the love story that had started in tragedy and become a legend in its own quiet way. On a warm evening in the spring of 1910, 33 years after they had first met, Garrett and Adaline sat on their porch watching another sunset. They were in their 60s now, their faces lined and their bodies not as strong as they once were, but their love as vibrant as ever. "I would not change a single thing," Adaline said softly, echoing words they had spoken to each other many times over the years. Not one moment of it. Neither would I, Garrett agreed, kissing her hand. You were shivering in torn clothes at that market, and I wrapped you in my coat. Best decision I ever made. Best thing that ever happened to me, Adaline said, leaning her head on his shoulder. You saved me, and then you loved me, and you gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful from it. Their children were thriving, their grandchildren healthy and happy, their community stronger for their presence. They had done good in the world, both together and individually. The Wild West of their youth had largely faded away, tamed by law and civilization and progress. But the spirit of it remained in people like them, who had faced hardship with courage and built futures with determination and love. They had been shaped by that time and place, but they had also shaped it in return, leaving it better than they found it. As they grew older still, into their 70s, they remained each other's greatest companions and truest loves. They took care of each other through the aches and ailments of age, patient and gentle with each other's limitations. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, a feast that half the town attended. 50 years with the same person, Gabriel said in his toast at the celebration. My father once told me that the day he met my mother, the day he wrapped his coat around her in the market square, was the day his real life began. And watching them together all these years, I believe it. They show us what love really means, what it means to choose someone and keep choosing them every single day. Garrett looked at Adaline as their son spoke, seeing past the white hair and wrinkles to the frightened, brave woman who had stumbled into his life so many years ago. And she looked back at him with the same love and devotion he felt, her hand clasped firmly in his. They lived well into their 80s, an impressive feat for people of their generation. When Garrett passed peacefully in his sleep in 1920, Adaline was beside him, holding his hand just as she had held it for more than 4 decades. She grieved deeply but without bitterness, grateful for every year, every day, every moment they had shared. She lived 2 more years after him, staying in their house surrounded by memories and love, visited constantly by children and grandchildren who wanted to care for her and hear her stories. She talked about Garrett every day, keeping his memory alive, and everyone could see that, while her body remained in Skidoo, her heart was already with him. When Adaline passed in her sleep on a cool autumn morning in 1922, her family buried her beside Garrett in the Skidoo Cemetery on a hill overlooking the town they had loved. The whole town attended the funeral, 3 generations of people whose lives had been touched by the couple who had found each other in a market square 45 years earlier. Their tombstone was simple, just their names and dates, but someone had added beneath it, they found each other in darkness and created light. It was a fitting epitaph for 2 people who had taken tragedy and trauma and transformed it into a love story that had lasted a lifetime, who had built a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The house they had shared remained in the family, passed down to Gabriel and eventually to his children. The schoolhouse that bore Adaline's name continued to educate children. The peace and justice that Garrett had worked to maintain remained the foundation of the community. Their love story became part of Skidoo's history, told and retold, inspiring others to believe that even in the darkest moments, there can be hope, there can be connection, there can be love. Years turned into decades, and Skidoo changed and grew, but the memory of Garrett and Adaline Nash remained. Their descendants scattered across the West and beyond, carrying with them the values and love that had been modeled for them. And sometimes, on warm spring evenings, people walking past the old Nash house swore they could see 2 figures sitting on the porch in the gathering darkness, holding hands and watching the sunset together, eternal and beloved.